And so we are here this evening learning about growing your own vegetable transplants. And just let me tell you, this is not something that should be hugely intimidating for folks. I think sometimes you get, the misconception that it takes something remarkable to grow your own transplants. You see the lovely big giant plants coming out of greenhouses for sale. Those are great, but you can do a really good job at home with pretty minimal inputs. And so I want to encourage people to give this a shot. And there's a few reasons why, but this is one that if you've never tried this before, maybe this will be the season that you do give it a try. Let me just state quickly that, if I'm mentioning brand names or certain materials or retailers, it's not to be viewed as an endorsement by myself, nor the university, nor the failure to mention something else meant to be exclusion of something suitable. So just understand, if I mention things, it's so we can have a conversation and understand each other, but it's not meant to deign something as better than something else. So why do we actually use transplants in the garden? And this is pretty straightforward. I don't think this is earth-shattering to anyone. The primary reason we do it for most crops is simply we get to a harvest quicker when we use transplants. We've started that plant growing earlier than we can outside in the native garden conditions. And so we get the harvest faster. And it is important because it does allow us to have harvest over a longer period, particularly when we're looking at warm season crops. We basically get harvest earlier than if we waited for ambient conditions outdoors to begin. Cool season crops in the spring, sometimes we get hammered by really hot weather in May. I think I've mentioned it before, and I guess I'm becoming the old man that repeats the same story every time you see me. But we had about 1/8 of an acre or so of broccoli out as a test plot, as a spring crop. It was looking great. And the last week of May, we ran into 90-degree temperatures about a week away from harvest, and it was done. And so if you can get an earlier start, which we got started when we wanted to, but unfortunately just didn't get done when we wanted to. But if you can get earlier started, you can skip that maybe. And you actually have a harvest on those cool season crops before hot weather arrives. At the same time, when we have fall gardens, which I encourage people to do as well, we can actually get a harvest before we get the frost that ends that plant. And so starting early, getting things going early allows us to basically fit our production window, which is important, especially when you're trying to maximize production out of a garden. It gives you the ability to do that. It also gives us a larger plant going into the ground, so it's not a seed coming up. And sometimes that can be really good when we have high pest pressures. So I knew a farm that, they broke all the rules of rotation and things like that. They would repeatedly plant things like zucchini and squash basically in the same fields year after year. They would do cover crops in the winter, which might help, but they had really high insect pest pressure. So if they just put out a little bitty seed out there to grow, although normally we don't often transplant our cucurbit crops because they do great from seed. Having a plant that was multiple weeks old going in the ground in that scenario is better than having a very young seedling coming out of the soil. They were better able to resist the damage from the plants. So there are scenarios where having that larger, stronger plant is a very good thing to have in our toolbox. It does reduce some tasks because typically whenever we transplant at the desired spacing we want. So we're not going back, we're not thinning, we're not replanting where maybe we got seeds too deep and they didn't come up. So basically when you transplant, it's done. You've kind of established the garden, or at least that part of the garden. And the other thing that can be helpful, this is good. So we do some school gardens with kids. And so we will actually transplant things like radishes. I don't recommend you do that in your home garden. I don't think there's much point to it, but whenever you've got kids, it's much easier to have them transplant something than it is maybe to have them get small seeds where they need to be at the depth they need to be. So sometimes if you're dealing with physical or mobility limitations, or maybe you're working with kids, sometimes a transplant is actually easier for success in the garden. So those are just some of the reasons. And probably the one that I think is the best of all, variety. So there is unmeasurable, or I guess you could count them, I suppose. But to me, the variety that is out there on the market of many of our vegetables is astounding. The colors, the shapes, the sizes, the taste, it's all over the board. And so, this is just one real quick snapshot from a seed company website. You've got blue tomatoes, cherry and grape, green, orange, pink, purple, red, striped, white, yellow. And there's probably some more that aren't on there that could be. I think I've mentioned some of these classes earlier this season. There are actually stuffing tomatoes that essentially grow like a pepper, where they're virtually hollow inside. And those are the kind of transplants you're not going to find very often, certainly not at large box stores. Occasionally you may find them at regional greenhouses or something like that. But if you're growing your own, you can have whatever weird all-ball, whatever you want, because you're producing those transplants. You're not at the mercy of selection of what 95% of gardeners want. You can have what you want. And so I think that's important. The other thing is the timing of transplants. It is not unusual at all to see copious amounts of tomatoes and peppers at stores in the middle of April, 3 to 4 weeks before we want to be planting them in our garden, really. And then when you get to the proper time, there's not much left. And so sometimes, you're trying to do things right. You're trying to put them out when we're, in those frost-free dates, but everybody else planted too early and now there's nothing left. So when you're producing your own, you get to time that finished transplant to when you're going to have it in the garden. So you don't have to take leftovers. You don't have to buy things early and nurse them along in a window or something like that. And to me, if you like gardening, if you like plants, I think growing transplants is fun. As much as you want to learn about the technical side of seed, and I've forgotten a lot from college, but at one time I knew a lot of that stuff. But at the end of the day, it's still pretty neat how seeds turn into plants. And I find it fun. So I know as a gardener, I enjoy it. I think all that is inherent to growing your own transplants. I think I have to be honest and say there's also some reasons we may not choose to grow our transplants. And I understand that. One of those is the limitations, and those can be different depending on everyone's situation. But the time, do you have time to look after them? Basically, you want to keep an eye on transplants when you're growing them. You probably want to check them at least daily. And especially earlier on, you may be checking them twice a day. The other thing, there is some cost associated with it. I think by and large, we can probably produce them for a similar price that we can buy them at. Maybe not always the case, but again, we're getting the selection of varieties, I think, helps tip the balance on the cost side. One thing that might come into play is space. If you've got dogs or toddlers or anything like that, you're going to have a place where you can put these and they're not going to have a problem. And so sometimes we may not have that in our living area. And so you may not be able to produce transplants simply because of the setup you have. And that's okay. Another thing is that, let's be honest, not everything needs to be transplanted. Even tomatoes and things like that, they can actually be direct sown out in the garden. So let's not say that we must do transplants, because it's not quite true. The other thing we need to be aware of is not everything transplants great. So cucurbits, so that is our cucumbers, cantaloupes, squash, that whole family, they really don't like to be transplanted. They don't like their roots disturbed. So lots of times you'll see recommendation that if you are going to transplant those, use something like a peat pot, where you're going to plant the whole thing in the ground and not disturb the roots. And it's simply because basically anytime we transplant something, it's got to get reacclimated to where you're planting it. And some things do that better than others. Cucurbits are particularly not the best at that. So there might be some limited benefit to doing them as transplants. Again, there are scenarios where it may benefit, but not everything transplants great. So it's not that we must produce our own transplants to be successful in the garden, but certainly it is a good tool to have in our toolbox if we are gardeners. So what can we transplant? This is from one of the UT publications. That'll be on the list of resources. There's a lot of things that we can transplant, but you'll notice there's also a lot of things that we can direct sow, and many of the different vegetables are actually easily produced both ways. So just understand, again, depending on what you grow, there may or may not be an actual benefit to growing transplants. And don't think that that means you're out of the game if you want to grow some of these, because a lot of them are doing great from direct sowing of seed directly into our gardens. Some very basic thing about growing transplants. What's good is we do like to see a difference in day and night temperatures, which generally most houses, we see this anyway, particularly in sunnier rooms. We'll see daytime temperatures rising and then lowering at night. The allowable temperatures vary sort of depending on what plants we're doing, but basically ambient household conditions work for most everything. We can be successful at growing transplants just at where we're going to be comfortable living in. We do want to be aware to keep things away, or plants, I should say, not things, keep plants away from direct drafts, but we like airflow. We don't want them stuck in a room with a closed door, in part because we don't want moist air sitting in one space. We'd like to see it move around. So airflow is a positive thing. It is something that, like I do some transplants in my office, and, invariably from time to time, I spill water, I splash dirt out of a pot or a container when I'm watering things. So there can be a little bit of a messy factor to this. Take that in consideration. Don't put this on the white carpeting in the living room or something, unless you've got a really understanding spouse. But honestly, there can be a mess to it sometimes. So we do want to talk about what we are literally growing our seeds in whenever we're growing transplants, or even if we're doing container gardening. Really, we're not growing in soil, and sometimes we'll see potting soil used as a term. It's probably not true, because most of our medias that we use in these containers do not contain any soil whatsoever. That's not a bad thing. Whenever we take soil out of situation where it is in the garden, we kind of lose some of the positive elements because we're messing up the structure to it that we would like to see. And often too, if we're pulling stuff out of the garden, we don't know, is it sterilized? Are there already pathogens in there that are going to attack our young seedlings? So we really don't use any soil unless we have it sterilized first. And certainly you can do that. I will say I have heated soil in an oven before. Goodness, it stinks. So just be aware of that if you're going to do it. Make sure it's a warm, sunny day in the spring, because you're going to want to air out the house if you try that, because I have tried that. When I was in college, they used steam sterilization in the greenhouses for stuff, and it always stunk up the greenhouses and the head houses. So it's just the nature of when you're heating up soils, you get a lot of odors produced. So just be aware of that if you take that route. What's good? We have a lot of good media options out there. There's not one brand or only, one type of soil potting media I'd recommend. Basically, our potting medias are primarily composed of materials like peat moss. They'll include things like perlite, composted barks. We are seeing some newer materials come into the market, and it's not a bad thing. A lot of them are trying to compensate or at least reduce the amount of peat moss that's being used. So you'll see things like rice hulls added into them. There are wood fiber products that are getting added into it. And so don't be surprised if you start seeing potting medias that maybe look a little bit different. Rice hulls have probably been used for the past 15 years or so in a lot of large commercial operations. So you may have seen things that looked a little odd. If you were buying plants that have been potted from like big box stores, you may have been seeing rice hulls. So just understand that there is a whole host of different materials. I don't really advise people to mix their own soils or potting medias, because at the end of the day, the amount of money you're going to have invested in it by buying the individual components, you can much more cheaply just go buy the finished product. And I don't think you gain a lot. Maybe if you're trying to raise something highly unusual as house plants or something that requires a very specific environment for its roots, maybe there's a positive reason to do it. But I think certainly for something like seed starting, anything we'll use. I will say you don't have to use seed starting mix. And actually, that's my next slide, so I'll be quiet. The other thing I generally tell people when buying potting media, don't buy the cheapest, don't buy the most expensive. The cheapest is probably cheapest because it's low quality for some reason, but the most expensive is probably a name or a gimmick or something about it. Mid-grade products are going to be very comparable from different brands. So don't think you have to buy the most expensive thing in the store. And specifically, you don't have to use a seed starting mix. So all the seeds that I start, I just use a general potting media or potting soil. You just want to start with that sterile mix because, again, you've got young seeds that could be easily attacked by any number of different pathogens. Some potting medias do have larger components, especially when they're having more bark, like composted bark materials in it. So depending on your bag of media, you may want to sift it or just, pull out some of the larger chunks as you're filling your trays or your containers, whatever they are. But so sifting is fine, but I don't think for the vast majority of seeds that you must buy seed starting media. The only difference between seed starting medias and those that are just your general potting mix is that they have finer materials in them. So either they've been sifted or they've been ground, so you don't have large particles in it. For a lot of these seeds, it's not going to be any concern. So again, I have successfully grown a whole host of different things, and you do not have to buy seed starting media. You can if you like to, nothing wrong with that, but it's not an absolute requirement. You do want to make sure that you pre-moisten the media that you're using, particularly because peat, when it dries out, is hydrophobic, meaning it actually doesn't absorb water. So it's why you should never see a recommendation to use peat moss as a mulch, because if you do and you get a rain, your peat moss floats away because it's not getting wet. So certainly incorporating it as a soil amendment in the garden is something that can be done, but peat moss, when it goes dry, it wants to stay dry. And so even the day before, I would encourage you to wet your potting media so that you can keep it in the bag and pour the water into the bag and put it into a bucket or another container, add the water to it there. This is something that, commercial greenhouses very often when they're in the potting season, the day before, when they shut down for the day, they'll restock like the tables or the machines, and they'll wet things down. It's just because if you don't, you're going to have a hard time getting it wet to begin with. So give it time. So overnight is a great time to allow the water to sit there and then mix it up well the next day. If you are planning on growing a lot of different seedlings, you may want to look at sourcing a larger size container from like farm stores, or, basically you can buy larger compressed bales of product instead of buying small bags. The per ounce or pound price is much more attractive when you can buy a larger unit. So if you're going to be doing a lot, you may want to look at seeing if you can find a larger unit to purchase rather than buying a lot of small things. It just saves you money in the long run. Containers, there is no end to the possibility of what container you can grow seedlings in. The big thing is, no matter what we're growing, they have to allow water to drain. Roots have to have water. I think we all learned that in probably second grade, but they also have to have air. So within our soils, we have space for water and air, and they're antagonistic to each other. And what I mean by that, if we fill it up with water, we don't leave room for air. And the reason we need air in our soils is our roots need oxygen, because the leaves essentially will send down the carbohydrates that they produce for energy from photosynthesis, but then the roots have to actually burn that. They have to do respiration, which is what we do. And to do that, you have to have oxygen. So the roots will take in oxygen, combine it with the sugar, and they get energy. And so we have to have an aerated root system, and that means we have to have the ability for water to drain away. And that also means we can't keep containers sitting in 2 inches of water, because that's going to waterlog the very bottom. So at worst, we're only going to have roots in that area that's not waterlogged. That's actually the best, is we just have a smaller root system. The worst is we kill off roots and we actually get infections from different pathogens. So we do want to make sure we have free draining. If you end up with a lot of water in the tray underneath your seedlings, dump it out. Don't leave it sit there for days. So after you water, half hour later, come back and dump that out. As you get used to doing this, if you've not done it before, you'll kind of get a hand on how much you should be watering. You'll kind of see, okay, if I do half of the container or half of the watering can, I don't have a ton of water left in the bottom. So just be aware, we don't like things standing in water, and we must have drain holes in a container that we're growing our seedlings in. We want to make sure that transplants can be easily removed without doing significant damage to their root system. So a lot of plants will grow thick, healthy, robust root systems. They're easy to pop out of containers that are flexible. So it's not that this is entirely limiting, but we do want to think about what we're doing. And certainly we can cut away or tear away, depending on what material a container is made of, to actually get those seedlings out of there. Obviously, you know, specifically made seedling trays or packs are great and readily available, but they don't have to be the ones we use. There are a lot of peat-based things out there. There's pellets, there's pots. Those can work. Those can dry out fast, and they have some other negatives and positives. I very often use cups, like plastic cups or styrofoam cups. 6 to 8 ounces is great for a lot of our transplants. I'm not trying to grow in a ginormous size of a plant. You know, for most of what we grow, you don't want to start your seeds 6 to 8 weeks or only around 6 to 8 weeks before we want to plant them out. That's why we're doing this talk basically the middle of March. That's going to give us a good hit towards the 1st of May. I don't want a 3-month-old tomato transplant that I'm trying to put out in the garden. It's going to be stunted unless I've been growing it in a really large container. I've been sizing the container up as it grows. So let me encourage you not to plant too early. But certainly plastic cups are something that are readily available, and they can even be reused. Here's a whole host of different options. I would say they all have negatives and positives associated with them. Certainly you can make your own from newspapers. Good thing about those can be bigger or smaller, depending on exactly what you're essentially wrapping the newspaper around to make your pot. On the upper left-hand corner, you see a toilet paper roll. Great way to do some recycling. Probably not a great way to grow a transplant unless you want it to be really small. That's the same problem I have with growing transplants in something like an egg carton. You don't really have much soil volume there. So unless you're growing something really small that you're going to very quickly be planting out, don't use something small. That's the same problem I have a lot with the peat pellets. We actually use peat pellets like when I'm doing radishes or lettuces that we're doing with the school gardens, because they're small, don't take up a lot of room, and they're adequate for a really small transplant. But I'm not going to plant my tomatoes in a peat pellet. And yes, I realize there are different sizes of peat pellets available. It's still, I don't think, ideal for a larger transplant. So the smaller the container, the more quickly you need to have that transplanted out, because we don't want to be having big plants in small containers, because what we have are big plants with small root systems. So, you know, you will see a lot of recommendations on possible sizes. I would say there's no hard and fast about anything, but certainly there are options out there, some smaller, some larger. Just play with it and just realize I would probably err on the side of maybe slightly too large than way too small. I think there's more benefit to something growing into a container than having something way too small. And certainly we can start small. A lot of people will actually germinate their seedlings in mass in a single pot. So you may have 30, 40, 50 of whatever in a single pot. Once they've popped up, and generally once they start getting a true leaf or two, you start taking those out and transplanting them into a container to grow. Nothing wrong with that. That's done a lot commercially, simply to save space in greenhouses and limit the amount of area you have to heat. So it works great. But again, we wouldn't keep a plant in a very small container for long. What about those dome thingies or heat mats? So what those clear domes do, and all of our stores are full of them this time of year, so obviously we must need them. But in truth, all they do is retain moisture and prevent things from drying out. But they do reduce the amount of light that's reaching your transplant. So basically, if you're going to use one, and those times I have used them and often I do not, but when I do, as soon as I start seeing germination, I take it off because I don't want to limit light. Light to me is the biggest challenge whenever we're growing our transplants. So by passing through that plastic, we're losing some of the value or strength of that light. So I'm going to get rid of it as quick as I can if I use it. And so certainly when we're doing some cuttings and things like that, there's different reasons to keep really high humidity for a long period of time. Seedlings are supposed to have a functioning root system on it. Functioning root system is going to replenish any water they're using. So I'm not worried about drastically increasing the humidity level to reduce the water the plant is using, because I want a strong root system that's pumping the water. If it doesn't have a strong root system, I'd rather the seedling die, because it's going to happen when it goes in the garden if it doesn't have a good root system. So I think as soon as you're starting to get germination, you can pull it off. Heat mats, they can speed germination. You can get them up out of the ground faster. A few things like watermelons and something like that, it's probably very important. Other than those, I don't think they're critical for success at all. Again, and in the next slide, I'll point you to a resource where you can check it out. There's a lot of seeds that have a germination temperature window of 30 or 40 degrees. So you may have a optimum on the higher end, but you can still have a lot of success if you're in the middle. And so you don't have to have heat mats. The other thing, as soon as I see germination, I'm pulling that heat mat out, because when you take a seedling and you're providing it a ton of heat, they'll start growing faster. Now, that sounds great, but then you end up with a 3-inch tall seedling with 2 little spindly leaves on it. And as they get bigger, they fall over, you break them when you're trying to move things around. So it actually is more damaging to leave that heat under there. Use it to speed germination if you want to. It is not in any way, shape, or form a requirement. And then get it out of there. And again, if we're growing cool season crops, if we're doing things like broccoli and cabbage or something like that, which we would start those about middle of February in our area. If we're doing something, 1st of February in our area. And if we're doing something like that, we don't need heat under them. They're going to be okay at ambient temperatures in our houses. They'll be fine. So it's not at all a requirement, and it's really remarkable how wide a range. So these are some germination temperatures just pulled from one of the UT publications. The one I mentioned down there on the bottom has a much larger table, and actually a couple of different tables looking at germination temperatures and optimum germination temperatures. So there are any number of plants that are going to do great at room temperature. You'll notice here for almost all of these, certainly some of them are more warm season. I would say the germination temperature in that table might be considered the optimum temperature. So if you're at 70 degrees with cucumbers and eggplants and tomatoes and peppers, you're going to be fine. You're still going to get good germination. Watermelon, particularly seedless watermelons, are not great germinators. So a lot of commercial producers take a lot of great pains to grow seedless watermelon plants. And so that would be one I might say is more on the required side with heat mats. Muskmelon, I don't think they're as critical as watermelon by any stretch. So cantaloupes, I think we can still do good in most ambient conditions in the house. Again, if you want to use it for a brief time and then you're done. So I mentioned earlier that I think light is probably our most limiting factor when it comes to producing seedlings, because what happens so often is we see little seedlings that are kind of like the picture there in the bottom. You have basically them growing towards a light source. And so that long stretched out appearance, along with the yellowing of those cotyledons, that is all typical of something that is needing more light. So when we see plants that look like that, when we get that elongation, that stretching, that is absolutely keying us in that we've got too little light there. In almost all instances, a window is not going to cut it. If you've got a nice bay window that's got a great clear, view south and east and west, all three, okay, maybe you can get by without it. But almost universally, and even probably in those cases, you're going to have better quality transplants if you use some supplemental light. And now it doesn't have to be dramatic. Fluorescent has been used for decades successfully, and certainly LED, the newer one on the market, is able to be used. I will say I personally don't have experience growing seedlings under LEDs. And I do think it's now harder to find fluorescent either fixtures or tubes as well. So we may be pushed to LED to give that a shot. But
LEDs have worked great.
Good. And that's it. And LEDs come with a significant cost savings on the energy they use. They are more expensive. They should be longer life than even fluorescents. But as I say, I do think we're going to see them become the standard for good reason, good performance. What I do want to have in my system is the ability to have that light, 2 to 4 inches above the surface of the soil when I'm germinating, and then the ability to raise it as they're growing. So what's good is to put lights, whatever you're using, and this is just from one publication where they were looking at the different types of fluorescent lights. And so you do have different varieties out there at different wattages, and they were looking at, cost of fixtures. And so essentially any of these actually can work. And my next one, I'm probably skip this because again, this is just, a little bit saying we've got these different varieties. They have different characteristics, but at the end of the day, any of these options fluorescent can grow. And I would extend that to most LEDs as well. And here's why. So this was from the University of Maryland. And so I'm not going to read every word on there, but they were looking at, for instance, the fluorescent bulbs that are just cool white tubes, not any sort of growing light or specific spectrums like that. And what they found is these cheap ones, which these are the cheapest ones you could get at that time, they still worked very well to produce even things like salad greens or vegetable plants. The reason is because the period of time that we have those plants under these lights is brief compared to their overall life. And so while those lights are lacking certain spectrums that we would like to see on grow lights for things that were actually growing to maturity, to flowering, to fruiting, for producing a little green transplant, which essentially is the name of the game, they're perfectly great. They do a good job even, and they're one of the cheapest options. So don't think you have to have the super duper awesome setup of grow lights to make that transplant happy. We're talking about, again, 4 to 6 weeks, maybe for something slower growing like peppers, maybe 8 weeks. But we can have a really good transplant using just cheap fluorescent lights. We don't have to have this awesome setup. Certainly, if we're growing plants longer to greater maturity, to flowering, to fruiting indoors, that's when we have a grow light as a positive for us and as maybe a requirement, because we are asking more of that plant. And so it all comes down to just what spectrum are present. And so that's what I don't know about LEDs always. Certainly there are a lot of LED lights out there that are grow lights. I think they will do great. What I don't know yet is if like the El Cheapo setups for like $20 for a shop light, that's a LED, how they will do. I haven't done it yet myself, and I haven't seen anybody reporting on it. So I think that'll be interesting to see. Certainly nicer LED setups do great. There's commercial operations that grow indoors with them, some illegal, some not. But I'm interested to see if the cheap fluorescent shop lights, which have proven themselves to work, if the cheap LED shop lights will work as well. I don't know that yet. So I think that'd be interesting to try. Again, I want the ability to have that light close to the plants when they're small. It's remarkable how quickly you lose light over a distance. So if you've got your lights a foot above little small seedlings, they are going to stretch on you. They're going to be reaching for that light. Have it close above. The big thing is watch the heat. So this is actually the setup out of my office. You'll notice that little like white pigtail hanging down from the lights. That's actually where you plug the bulb into. I took that off one of the bulbs because I was getting too much heat. So in fact, I actually run on the basis I run it on is it's actually a 6 bulb setup, and I typically run no more than 4. And so I can switch off some lights, but I also even keep one unplugged just so I don't fry them. Because for whatever reason, even though these are grow lights and they're fluorescents, they put out a ton of heat. So I have to be careful that I don't cook plants under here. So I actually don't have the full light on all the time because I am afraid I'm going to burn them up. And I also have my timing on this. I don't just have the lights on for 8 hours at a run. I'll have it on for an hour and then off for 30 minutes, then on for an hour. Then it just varies. It's not exactly perfect because I had just one of those little timers where you got to poke all the little pins down and everything. So sometimes 2 went down, sometimes 3. So it's not an exact science with me. It's just, I don't want to have a really long light period where I'm building up a ton of heat under there. And again, it's just for the plants. I'm not worried about it burning down, but I am worried about cooking my plants. But what I also have, and you kind of see at the top, you see those are actually 2 wires. So these lights actually were made to have these hangers attached to it. And so if you look real closely at the bottom of those black trays that those seedlings are in, you'll see the wire on the light below stretching across, and there's a hook. So I'm able to raise and lower it pretty easy. I just have to lift up on the unit and move the hook to a different rung on the shelf, so to speak, to raise and lower my lights. So as they grow, I raise the light because I don't want them touching the light, because even fluorescents, they will get burned on those if they're directly in contact with lights. So the ability to keep that light close to the canopy is important. I don't want even 10 inches to be there. That would be more. We'll see stretching. To me, it's remarkable how quickly we see stretching when we raise the distance from lights. But if you've ever played with a light meter at all, you know, just moving a short distance can dramatically drop the amount of light energy that's actually being received. So closer to the light is better. Be aware of the heat though, if you have lights that are dumping a lot of heat. One thing I always want to caution people is don't over fertilize your seedlings. You may have fertility in your growing media. That's fine. If you do, you don't have to do anything. If you don't, you might want to fertilize with a supplemental fertilizer. Wait till they're up and have true leaves, and then only use the half rate of the fertilizer. So if it says mix 1 tablespoon to a gallon of water, mix half a tablespoon. Because these plants aren't needing a ton of fertilizer. We want them to have readily available nutrients, but we're not trying to push them really hard with a lot of fertilizer. So start gradually. Don't worry about these things running out of food. Most of the time, you're not going to have that problem. Again, a lot of our medias do come with some fertilizer in it. If it does, you probably don't even have to do the fertilizer at all. Wait till they're out in the garden and you can fertilize them. When you sow the seed, and this isn't an exact science, you know, certainly we can do this with kids and they pull it off. So I have faith that most of us can do it as well. Basically, you fill up your container, whatever you're using, most of the way with that potting media. I like to go ahead then and water in the media. One of the reasons I like to do that is if I have little bitty seeds and I put them on the surface of the soil and I water, they can float off and flow off the container. Now I've lost my plants. So I like to water my media before I put my seeds in there. So I do that. That also lets me see if suddenly my full container or nearly full container shrinks down because of air pockets and now it's half full. I don't have to dig the seeds back out before I add more potting media to it, because we do want a full container. I don't want my little plants being surrounded, you know, by 2 inches of cup. If I'm using a cup, for instance, before they get up above the sides, I want them to be very quickly exposed to light that I have there. So I'll put the seeds on top of that wetted media Then I will put a little bit of media over top of that. And I'm done. And you can press it down, you can firm it down. There's nothing wrong with that, especially with larger seeds. But this is not something that's tricky. In commercial operations, a lot of this is done by, automation, by mechanics. It is not something that is hard to do. Don't overthink it. Everybody can be successful with this. Again, I don't like to put my seed on top of the soil and then water, because I'm afraid I'm going to wash it off, is the short answer. So that's why I do it in this process. Now, certainly there are some seeds you're not going to be worried about that. So you may put your seed in there, throw dirt on it, and then water it, and it's not a problem. Again, this is one of those things where this is the only correct way to plant a container for a transplant. It's not. We just talked about earlier, you can even sow all your seeds into a container and then pull out those individual little seedlings and transplant them into this. So this just is kind of a foolproof method. So I know I don't wash my seed out of something I just planted. So that's why I do this process. Generally speaking, if there's one problem that happens at this stage, it's that the seed can get planted too deeply. So the rule of thumb always is twice the width of the seed. That's how deep it should be planted. The problem is we got some little tiny seeds that, that means what they're basically on the soil surface. And so again, be careful you don't plant little seeds too deeply, because it does make a challenge for them to grow up and actually reach the light. So you can plant a seed so deeply that it germinates, it grows, but it never actually reaches that light. And so it can't do photosynthesis and it dies. So make sure you don't do that with small seeds. Obviously, the smaller the seed, the more shallow we plant it. I always like to encourage people, look at your seed packets. Seed packets have good information on it. It doesn't matter what company you're buying from, whether you're buying the really cheap things that you find at the dollar store, therefore for $1, or you're buying the organic, high dollar seeds you can find wherever you want. Doesn't matter. They're all going to have information that tells you about spacing, about planting depth, about things like that. So pay attention to those, because you can sometimes find some things that are different and may surprise you. Once I was looking at different pea seeds, and I think it was one I actually got at a trade show. So it was a promotional thing. It still had information on the back, but the spacing on it was totally different from what you would expect a pea to be. The reason is it was one of the peas that is only a tendril forming pea. It never actually grows leaves. So when you have those, you plant them much more closely together because it's not as bushy of a plant. And so you can put more in a small space. So, just by looking at the name of the pea, I couldn't have told you that. But by reading the packet, I then knew that and understood why it had that difference. So again, packets I think are sometimes overlooked, but oftentimes they have awesome information on it. I will say, if you are sowing things, you are more than welcome to sow more than one seed per container or sale, if we're looking at sale packs or whatever. But I'm going to encourage you to thin those to a single plant. It is much better to have one nice strong plant than it is to have two plants that have been shading each other and fighting over resources and aren't as robust. So I'm going to encourage you to really look at thinning it down always to a single plant. Doesn't mean there aren't scenarios where maybe you can let two tomatoes stay in the same container if it's a large container you're growing your transplants in, but 90% of the time it's going to be better to have a single plant in there. Another tip, be aware there are some things that are really sensitive about being buried because they actually need light to germinate. So things like lettuce and dill, snapdragons, and petunias, we want to be super cautious with how much we cover them over. Certainly, it doesn't mean we can't cover them over some, but if you cover these over really well and thoroughly, you're going to have a challenge with them germinating well. So just be aware of that. If you've planted some of these in the past and maybe you had hit or miss germination on them, it could be they were buried too deeply. Lastly, label everything. You won't remember which end of the tray you put the red tomatoes versus the yellow tomatoes. It never works out. If it does work out for you, you're a better gardener than I am. Eventually you'll find out in the garden which is which, but if you want to know at the seedling stage, you better label everything. And dates are good too, just because you start thinking, well, how many days ago did I plant this? Should they be germinating now? Why don't I see something? Sometimes having that date on there just can reassure us that no, we still got a couple of days. It's okay. Watering is probably the second worst challenge when it comes to producing transplants. We keep things too wet. When seedlings are small and little, I don't actually like to use a watering can or anything like that. I like to mist them, because then I'm just misting and wetting the top surface of the soil. It's not getting real deep, because a little bitty plant in a container that's very wet is setting myself up for disease problems. So I'd rather have to come back and water more frequently when they're little than to keep them wet all the time and have any number of different seedling diseases that we'll mention in just a moment. So the other thing to understand, as things get bigger, they do need more water. So we don't water the same way when it's a 1 year old, 1 day old seedling as it is 3 weeks old. One, we can let things dry out more as they get older. That can be a way of hardening those seedlings off, but also they're going to be using more water. So as things are little, we water them a little. As they grow, we water them more. So it's not always the same way. Just be aware of that change. So spray bottles are great when you've got little bitty seedlings coming up. Not so good when you got 3 week old tomato plants. So just be aware we do make changes on how we water. And again, don't leave things standing in water. We are worried about water because of diseases. So fungal diseases such as damping off, which is typically caused by Pythium. Basically, you see a few things happening. We'll see, kind of fuzzy growth on the soil or on the plants. You see kind of there on the left picture where you have that very narrowed stem on that plant. That's actually because it's been attacked by fungus, by Pythium, and basically it's killed it. You've got to have all your plant parts there to have a happy seedling. And the number one thing we can do to prevent this is let things dry out more. Don't keep them as wet. So again, this is where when they're little, water them as they need, but don't overwater. Another thing I like to do is use fans on seedlings. Does a few things for me. In my case, because I have the heater of a light set up, it dissipates the heat. So I don't cook plants if I keep a fan blowing on them. So when I do have all the bulbs turned on, I'm really wanting to get a lot of light in there, I better have my fan on or I'm going to cook somebody. So it helps me if I've got a problem with heat, takes care of my heat problem. The other thing it does, it helps reduce excess moisture. So plants, they take up water, they release it as water vapor from their leaves. That creates high humidity around them. High humidity can encourage disease. So if I can get that wet air out of there, I'm better off from a disease standpoint. So I like it to have a fan on there because I can get rid of that wet, moist air. You're also going to dry things out a little faster. Understand that when it comes to watering needs, but I like having the fan there for that reason. And the third reason I like it is actually when we have plants that are physically moving because of breeze or because of a fan, we actually end up with a smaller, shorter, stockier plant. We can also do this physically by touch. So you can actually brush plants. So like in commercial operations that are growing things, especially in containers and pots, lots of times they will have automatic watering booms that move back and forth over the top. A lot of them will put material on them that's very soft and gentle, but basically it's like a curtain that brushes those plants as it's going back and forth, because that physical stimulus will actually keep those plants smaller and shorter and stockier, which is really important when you're shipping plants and moving plants because you want to make sure everything fits, but it actually produces a better quality plant whenever we go out to the garden. So one way I can replicate that is by having a fan in there. You can also go in there by your hand and actually brush your plants over gently. You could use, a stick or a PVC pipe or something like that, obviously with caution, because you can certainly damage plants. But a fan will do the same thing for us. This is also why we truly don't need to frequently stake trees. When you stake a tree and you do it tightly and it removes movement, you actually end up with a weaker tree that's going to fail on you. It's probably going to break. And it's because the movement encourages it to basically create a thicker stem or trunk, grow the roots deeper. It's kind of like with us, and if we don't have movement, our muscles will atrophy. It's kind of in theory the same way. When these plants move, they're actually building more structure. And we want a plant that's well structured. So small, stocky plants don't translate that as little small plants that aren't good. Think of it as well-statured plants that are ready to go out in the garden and won't be bothered when the wind comes blowing and they don't fall over. So, I mean, it's good to have these plants that actually are able to withstand those sorts of forces. So because of that, and I'm just talking about a simple home fan, we're not talking about industrial fans or anything like that. If you've got a fan to move air around, that's exactly what we're talking about here. So don't think you need something fancy, not at all. Something cheap is more than adequate. I mentioned the phrase earlier, hardening plants off or hardening off plants. Basically, all it is anytime we have a plant that we're growing indoors, whether it's in a greenhouse or in our house, we basically have it in a very comfy, cushy environment compared to where we're going to stick it out when we put it in the garden. This is also why we transition out house plants that we have in our house, but that we have outside during the growing season, or we should do it. Because we can, for instance, I have sunburned many plants. Believe it or not, plants can actually get sunburned if we go from indoors to outdoors too quickly. So don't do what I do what I say. So the way we can harden plants is to take them outdoors for increasing amount of time. So when we have those pretty nice days, sunny, we can take plants out. We want to be careful about just sticking them out in full sun for 6 hours at a time. That's not a good plan. But for a few hours, especially if it's somewhere where they're shaded from the hottest part of the day, that's good. And we can increase the amount of time that they're in the sun as they get older and as we're getting closer to moving them to the garden. We can also allow things to dry out more. So we're not letting these plants wilt, but by not making water just immediately available all the time, that helps them to grow a more robust root system and helps get them used to the fact that it's not going to always be that paradise of growing that we place them in when we're producing them. So working on getting these plants to transition outdoors just means there's going to be less of a shock when we transplant them, and they're going to take off in the garden more quickly than if we had a sudden change in the environment. Very briefly, and we're not going to go into any great detail tonight on this, but just some basic thoughts on transplanting these out. Generally speaking, and this kind of holds true whether we're talking about vegetables or bedding plants or anything, if it's growing in a container, we basically put it out there in our garden at the same depth it was growing. So typically we don't want to bury things deeper. We may do it marginally if we have a wobbly transplant. If you want to plant it slightly deeper just to kind of firm up the trunk or stem a little bit, it's probably okay, but we're going to do that very minimally. Tomatoes are one that we can plant deeper because tomatoes will form adventitious roots on the stem. Adventitious just means that it's arising from something other than the root system. And so we probably all have seen, if we don't have tomatoes well caged, if the stem comes in contact with the ground, they root into the ground. And so that it's basically us taking advantage of that ability. But the problem is sometimes I will see where people say, I dig a hole 3 feet deep to bury my tomatoes in. That's not a good plan. So remember, we talked about we need oxygen for our root system. So really, majority of roots, and even on larger trees, if you see trees that blow over, look at how much of the root system is in the top 12 inches of the soil. There's a reason for that. And a lot of it has to do with oxygen availability. So certainly there are roots that can and do go deeper. And depending on the soil types we're talking about, that's a huge influence on rooting depth. But at the end of the day, the vast majority of that plant's root system is going to be in the top 12 inches of almost any plant. So because of that, just because you dig a really deep hole and just because you bury a plant doesn't mean you're going to get a better root system on it. Again, I'm not looking for that 24-inch tomato plant that I can put out in a hole in the garden. I'd much rather have a 5-inch tomato plant that goes out in the garden and that I plant at the same depth it was growing, because I have a small, rapidly growing plant with a well-sized root system for the amount of plant I have there. So don't think that the bigger the plant, the better it is. Oftentimes, smaller plants actually transplant established better because they do have the balance between essentially the above ground and below ground parts. So with that, here is the link to resources. If you are online, you'll also get an email with the links. Those of you here tonight have this on the handout, so take advantage of it. It is primarily the beginning gardening resources if you were in that session, but I did add in that Penn State resource about germination temperatures just because I found it interesting, and it's actually highlighted on there. So if you go to that document, look for the highlight, that's going to be the one that'll take you to that document. And so do we have any questions this evening?